Greetings and welcome to an overview of the material in Module 3 covering Chapter 4 in your text. This Part 2 overview within Module 3 addresses the issues found in our text in Chapter 4, which cover market segmentation and positioning, each of which is a crucial concept in marketing. The concepts of segmentation and positioning are key foundation elements to any marketing success story you might consider. I'm Dr. Russ Wallers in the Miller College of Business, and I'll be pointing out some key issues to focus on when reading the material within this learning module. In this session, we'll introduce the concept of market segmentation with particular emphasis on understanding the difference between generic and product markets. We'll discuss the procedure for segmenting markets and typical dimensions that might be useful to segment both consumer and business markets. We'll distinguish between qualifying and determinant segmentation dimensions. And finally, we'll examine the idea of product positioning and product differentiation, both key marketing strategy building blocks. In the way of a heads up, this material is important to study thoroughly, both in terms of fully understanding strategic marketing and also as a foundation for material covered later in this course. To start, let's cover some key terminology. These are terms used throughout this material. A generic market is a market with broadly similar needs and sellers offering various and often diverse ways of satisfying those needs. In contrast, more narrowly, a product market is a market with very similar needs and sellers offering various close substitute ways of satisfying those needs. Market segmentation is a two-step process of number one, naming broad product markets, and two, segmenting these broad product markets in order to select target markets and develop suitable marketing mixes. Segmenting refers to an aggregating process that clusters people with similar needs into a market segment. And finally, a market segment is a relatively homogeneous group of customers who will respond to a marketing mix in a similar way. And we'll talk about what homogeneity refers to. These are all important terms to a full understanding of the notion of market segmentation. Here are some examples that might help understand the difference between generic and product market segments. In terms of a generic market, you might think of the beverage market, which is a very broad market that refers to various product alternatives that might tap some underlying basic consumer needs. More narrowly, a product market might be thought of as colas within the beverage market. And a specific market segment within that cola product market might be the market for decaffeinated Diet Cola. A similar example, leisure might be thought of as a generic market, and within that there's a product market maybe consisting of competitive cruise lines, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, etc., Holland. Within that product market, there may be a specific narrower market segment for those looking for luxury cruises. Let me pose a question that might illustrate the difference. Is a contractor installing in-ground swimming pools selling pools, or more generically, entertainment, or possibly even a lifestyle? How you answer that question really has implications in terms of correctly defining competition. Competition is much broader within a generic market than it is within a market segment. If the contractor thinks it's the only swimming pool installer in town, it may think it has a monopoly. However, in fact, it's competing in a broader generic market. Consumers have many alternatives capable of tapping the underlying generic need set, and the market structure is in reality much more competitive. This is a very key concept in the way that marketers look at their market and also the nature of competition. There's a term in marketing called marketing myopia. In terms of understanding the distinction between generic and product markets, marketers need to avoid being nearsighted or myopic. The term marketing myopia is the error often made by many marketers by not thinking in terms of the generic market within which they compete. An example might be if Tropicana brand views itself competing for a share of the orange juice market, which is a fairly narrow product market. This is much more limiting than if it thinks of the market in terms of competing within the overall generic beverage market. Big distinction. The relationship between generic and product market definitions is shown graphically here. Managers need to think more about than just the product they already produce and sell. This can be done by naming product markets and generic markets with a four-part description. A generic market definition includes specification of customer needs. This refers to the needs of the customer or user that are being met by the product. Customer types identify who specifically is using the product, and the geographic area may identify where the market is located. In defining product markets, marketers provide names for each level of definition. We add the product type, the characteristic of the good or service offered. So hopefully this clarifies the difference. This is really not rocket science, but basically a process of consciously thinking about and identifying product service benefits that match up with underlying needs within each level of market definition. So to summarize, marketing segmentation is basically a two-step process. This process often fails when beginners start with the whole mass market and try to find one or two demographic characteristics to divide up or segment this market. The steps in market segmentation involve naming broad product markets or disaggregating. Marketers must break apart all possible needs into some generic markets and broad product markets in which the firm may be able to profitably operate. Segmenting is an aggregating process, clustering people with similar needs into a market segment. A market segment is a relatively homogeneous group of consumers who will respond to a specifically tailored marketing mix in a similar way. Segments should be uniquely homogeneous in terms of the expected stronger response to a tailored marketing mix in comparison to all other consumers in other markets. This is a very important distinction. Each of these is a potential market segment with uniquely similar needs that would be expected to respond uniquely and differently to different marketing mixes tailored and targeted to each group. In this particular graphic, we have 5 markets. Submarket 1, which is a potential market segment, consists of the exercisers. Their needs and the benefits they would expect in bicycles would differ and differentiate them from, let's say, those in submarket 3, the transportation riders. So the point is that each of these potential groupings are potentially market segments with different needs that may respond differently to different types of marketing programs specifically tailored to each market. As shown in this slide, the marketer can segment a market into any number of segments. In this particular slide, we have three potential market segments, A, B, and C, positioned in two dimensions. The horizontal dimension is dependability, and the vertical dimension is status. This is a potential product market for bicycles. Each of the dots or points in that graph represent a customer. So the idea here is that market segment A consists of a cluster of similar consumers that have a unique need set regarding the status dimension on the vertical axis and the dependability dimension on the horizontal axis. And these particular customers are different and distinguished from people in the market segment C that have a need set requiring a lower level of status and perhaps a higher level of dependability. So the question that we have here is, are these three specific segments of bicycle customers that would respond to three separately tailored marketing programs, perhaps three different types of products specifically targeted for those markets? Looking at this a little differently, I'm going to flip back and forth a couple times here. We can look at this array of customers as though there are three markets. We could probably define those a little further in even more detail. There may actually be six potential markets comprised of those same consumers. Here we have six different segments. The question is, do we have three markets or six markets? If we assume we have three markets and tailor three different marketing programs targeted for each of these three segments, perhaps a different product, a different way to promote the product, maybe different distribution channels, we have three separate marketing programs, and that will cost us X dollars. If we define the market based on six different segments, if we feel that the need set within each of these six potential segments is significant and unique enough that we would go to the trouble and expense of designing six different marketing programs, we're talking about investing a lot more marketing capital. The question is, do these six segments respond differentially, or would these six segments respond differentially and in a larger way to a set of six different market segments? So the question is, how far should a marketer go to aggregate similar consumers into target markets? The key issue is the criteria for segmentation is that the market needs to be homogeneous. Homogeneous relates to similarity within a market. The customer in a market segment should be as similar as possible with respect to their likely response to the marketing mix variables and their segmentation dimensions. Heterogeneous between, let's back up here a little bit. Regarding the question, how far should the marketer go in aggregating similar consumers into target markets, relates a question. A relevant question regards how far should the marketer go in aggregating similar markets into target markets. There are several key issues that relate to criteria for segmentation. One criteria deals with homogeneity or similarity within markets. The customers in a market segment should be as similar as possible with respect to their likely responses to marketing mix variables and their segmentation dimensions. The term heterogeneous or difference between customers, heterogeneity refers to differences between the customers in different segments should be as different as possible with respect to their likely response to marketing mix variables and their segmenting dimensions. Segmenters and combiners aim at different target markets. In this particular slide, in both of these rectangular portrayals of markets, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 possible underlying markets. The marketer may select one of these markets and adopt a single target market approach. That would be shown in the figure at the top. The figure at the bottom, given what's displayed right now, would show a multiple target market approach where the marketer may segment the markets and pursue a separate strategy for 3 of these individual markets and consciously ignore 2 of the markets as being not part of the overall target market. A combiner might look at these 5 potential markets and decide that a single marketing strategy may satisfy the needs of 2 of these markets. So the segmenter aims at specific, unique, small markets where the combiner tries to take advantage of some economies of scale by developing a universal approach marketing program that spans maybe 1, 2, or 3 different markets. Depends on the specific situation. That's the big difference between segmenters and combiners in terms of how they target specific markets. The segmenters try to satisfy individual markets very well by defining specific tailored marketing strategies at these smaller, well-defined markets. Combiners, on the other hand, try to satisfy larger combined markets pretty well. So the combiners pursue what we referred to earlier, I believe, as the shotgun approach, where the segmenters pursue more of a rifle approach. Segmentation may produce higher sales within smaller markets because the specifically tailored marketing program is satisfying the needs of consumers within those smaller segments more directly than a larger combining approach. So just because the strategy may involve targeting small markets, that does not necessarily mean that the sales would be lower, because the marketing job's a little more intensive. So with respect to the question, should we segment or combine, the answer is really to look at the profitability either way. Balancing the higher potential revenue from segmenting a market relative to the higher costs of developing a specific tailored marketing program for that market. Several key issues that have to do with criteria for segmenting markets. If we go to the trouble of developing specifically tailored marketing programs by breaking the larger mass market down into individual smaller market segments, the dimensions that we use to partition those markets should result in segments that are capable of meeting certain criteria. One criterion is that the market segments should be homogeneous or consist of needs similarity internally within each segment. The customers in a market segment should be as similar as possible with respect to their likely response to a marketing mix set of variables and these segmentation dimensions. So we should have homogeneity within market segments and also heterogeneity between and among the market segments, such that the customer in different segments should be expected to be different with respect to their likely responses to marketing mix variables and the segmentation dimensions. Another segmentation criterion mentioned by our authors is how substantial the market segmentation program is. By substantial, the authors are really referring to whether the segment is large enough to be profitable. So if we take a large market, break it down into smaller market segments, develop specifically tailored marketing programs for these smaller segments, is the marketing program profitability within each of those smaller segments substantial enough to stand on its own? That's what the authors refer to when they talk about whether a market is substantial. And also another criterion, finally, is whether the market segment yields an operational, practical uh, a final criterion would be whether or not the way the market is segmented uh, are the resulting market segments, operational. The segmenting dimension should be useful for identifying customers and communicating with them via available marketing communication tools and deciding on marketing mix variables. So in other words, that has to do with the doability of the segmentation variables. An example of operational criteria would be if we segmented a market geographically such that we focused on people in Indiana. That's a very easily identified group of people geographically, and we can use local media to realistically communicate with that market. On the other hand, if you define a market based on, let's say, some psychological variables, it's difficult to know who those people are and identify them and communicate with them efficiently. So that is a factor in certain cases. To to help select the important dimensions to segment markets, it's useful to think about two different types of dimensions. In this particular graphic, the two dimension types are qualifying dimensions and determining dimensions. There are a couple of key issues here to discuss. Qualifying dimensions are those relevant to include a customer type in a product market, and they help identify the core feature that must be offered to everyone in a product market. Determining dimensions or determinant dimensions are those that actually affect the consumer's purchase of a product market, of a specific product, or even a brand in a product market. Here's a possible example. Let's say we have the case of a marketer of luxury high-performance automobiles. What possible segmentation dimensions help define consumers within the firm's target market? A firm marketing high-performance luxury automobiles. How would you segment that market? What dimensions would be useful to break the market down into the appropriate target market? One possible dimension might be income. And income, which is a demographic variable, would probably be viewed as a qualifying dimension or an enabling factor that would group customers into that market segment based on their ability to afford the product. So more of a qualifying dimension. Lifestyle, on the other hand, or perhaps even attraction to the aesthetics of a specific product, may actually determine brand choice and therefore represent more of a determinant dimension or characteristic. Basically, qualifying dimensions qualify the customer as falling into a segment, whereas determinant dimensions drive brand choice. So that's a fairly big difference. Segmenting dimensions guide marketing mix planning. Market segmentation forces marketing managers to decide which product market dimensions might be useful for planning marketing strategies. A product market may be described by behavioral segmentation dimensions. Key issues here might be looking at needs For example, customer needs could be economic, they could be functional, they could be psychological. So we could define a market based on needs, which is a behavioral characteristic. We could define the market based on benefits sought. These tend to be situation specific. For example, a car buyer could be looking for a good gas mileage car, or possibly the ability to seat 7 people in a family. Thoughts? Buyers may be grouped by whether they have favorable or unfavorable attitudes or beliefs about the brand or product category. Rate of use. Some customers may be heavy users, medium users, light or even non-users. Purchase relationship. Customers could be segmented by whether they have an ongoing relationship or intermittent use or a bad relationship regarding a particular brand. Brand familiarity might vary from insisting on a brand to non-recognition or even rejection. Kinds of shopping refers to whether buyers do comparison shopping or perhaps buy on a convenience basis. Buyers might use different problem-solving approaches and could be grouped in this way. Or buyers may have different information needs. Some customers want a lot of information while others want very little. So these would be potential behavioral dimensions for segmenting consumer markets. We could also segment markets geographically. These are frequently used for segmenting markets. There may be different languages or laws or cultural practices or even climatic differences in different geographical areas that serve as a basis for developing tailor-made marketing programs for these different geographic areas. Size of city may be a factor that is linked to geography. The target market might be large cities or rural areas. So these are just a few potential geographic dimensions. In addition to behavioral and geographic dimensions, market segments may also be defined on the basis of demographic dimensions. Some example of demographics included in this exhibit might include income. Consumers' income could be household income, sex or age, family size or the stage of the family's life cycle. That would be related to age. Occupation, possibly education, ethnicity, or even social class. These are typical demographic dimensions that may be useful for defining market segments. Just as in the consumer sector, there are also many possible segmentation dimensions in the business or organizational market. Among these dimensions are the kind of relationship between a buyer and seller. Relationships might range from weak loyalty to strong loyalty to a vendor. Customer type. Customers may be segmented by whether they are service producers, government agencies, original equipment manufacturers, perhaps wholesalers, retailers, which has to do with the position they hold in the distribution channel. Business customers may be categorized demographically as well, including geographic location, size of the company or industry, and there is a host of data available published by the government on this for the business sector. How the customer will use the product. Will the product be sold? Will it be part of an installation? Will it be a component in manufacturing another product? Is it a raw material? That's a factor that may be useful. Type of buying situation. Some characteristics of the buying situation might include the number of people involved in the purchase or whether the buying process is centralized or decentralized. And even purchasing methods, referring to factors like whether the buyer uses bids, vendor analysis, e-commerce, or other methods of buying. These are just some samples or examples of ways that business markets might be segmented. Here are a couple terms that we use a lot in marketing. More sophisticated techniques may help in segmenting markets. There's a statistical technique called cluster analysis where the marketing manager looks at data associated with consumers and uses a statistical technique called clustering to see if there are groupings of consumers that exhibit some degree of homogeneity. That's cluster analysis, commonly used technique in marketing research. And another issue deals with customer relationship management. In marketing, we often use data mining techniques to go through customer databases and look for customers that have similar behavioral characteristics based on loyalty habits or how they purchase the product. So there are some techniques used in marketing that are pretty useful. Switching gears a bit, let's introduce another concept. This concept is related to segmentation, and the concept is one that we call product positioning. I think we'll all agree that Rolex watches have a specific image that the brand occupies in the minds of the consumers. I think when most consumers think of Rolex watches, they have certain attributes that come to mind, including high price, high quality, luxury, exclusivity, maybe snob appeal. Marketers can differentiate the marketing mix in order to meet consumer needs better than competitors and build a competitive advantage in that regard. Rolex has positioned its watch to appeal to a certain type of consumer occupying a certain market segment. A couple key issues and terms that are used in the text in connection with this discussion of positioning include differentiation. Differentiation refers to how the marketer tries to distinguish its offering in the marketplace, how it is set off from competition. What really matters is that the customer perceives the market. Another issue that's related to the concept of market segmentation that's introduced in our text is that of differentiation. This is related to the notion of product positioning. Differentiation refers to how the marketer tries to distinguish its product offering in the marketplace, how it tries to set off its product and marketing mix from those of competitors. And what really matters with respect to differentiation is that the consumer perceives the marketer's product as different and hopefully better. So that term differentiation or product differentiation is often closely linked to the concept of positioning. Positioning refers to how the customers think about the proposed and or present brands in a market. Marketing research techniques are designed to collect information about consumer perceptions and determine differences among competing products in the minds of consumers. Firms often use promotion to help position how a marketing mix meets target market customers' specific needs. Products can be positioned or differentiated based on differences in the product itself or in the way they're promoted, based on advertising appeals and so forth. So differentiation is a rather broad term, but it has to do with how the product is positioned in the marketplace to be perceived as different and better than the offerings of competition. Let's look at another slide that I think is quite illustrative of this principle. This diagram shows the output of a computer-generated positioning analysis that has generated a perceptual map of product positions for various brands of soap. Let's start with looking at the dimensions. Based on some marketing research data, let's assume that we determine that consumers view alternative brands of soap as being similar or different on the basis of two dimensions. Two attributes of soap that account for the greatest differences in consumer perceptions were identified, and they are the degree to which the soap is a deodorant soap, that would be shown on the horizontal axis, and the degree to which the soap is a moisturizing soap. Let's take a look at how the different brands involved in this study may fall. Here we have several competitive brands of personal bath soap. The position of each brand point shown here indicates its perceived position against each of these two dimensions, deodorant and moisturizing. We can see that here's, if you look at the cursor, lava soap is perceived in the lower left-hand quadrant as offering a fairly low level of moisturizing ability, and it's also on the horizontal axis perceived as a non-deodorant soap. And in contrast, if you go to the upper right-hand corner, here's Zest soap, Zest brand, perceived on the vertical axis as a moisturizing soap and on the horizontal axis as a deodorant soap. So the distance between these brand points implies the extent of differences and similarities. So if you look at the distance between, let's say, Zest and Lever 2000, those two brands are in very close proximity. If you look at the difference between, let's say, Zest and Lava, distance is quite greater, quite a great deal greater, and that would imply that there's a high level of perceived dissimilarity between these brands. So the closer that any two brand image points are to each other, the more similar those brands are assumed to be in the minds of consumers. These are based on consumer perceptions. Each segment may have its own preferences, and if we, right now we're looking at brand image points, we could also superimpose market segments on this product space map, and here we have eight different market segments. The position of each of these market segments relates to the ideal preferences held by people in each of those market segments. So for instance, individuals in market segment 1 are looking for this level of deodorant benefit, and they're not quite as concerned about the moisturizing ability. And in as much as Dial and Lifebuoy brands are located in close proximity to this particular segment 1, the assumption is that Dial and Lifebuoy would be the two brands that would be the most preferred among customers in market segment 1. We look at another segment. Here's market segment 4. Market segment 4 consists of consumers that want a lot more moisturizing, and they're not at all concerned at all with deodorant, the deodorant benefit. So for those consumers, Tone and Dove would be closer in proximity and therefore assumed to be much more preferred. So this product space map attempts to position both the brands and the ideal points of the different market segments regarding what benefits they're looking for. And incidentally, the size of these market segments, the way they're drawn, has to do with the size of these markets. We could also look at this a little differently. Here's Coast Soap. Coast Soap has a point right here, a moderate amount of moisturizing benefit and a moderate amount of deodorant benefit. It's possible to reposition brands in this product space map. If the marketers of Coast wanted Coast to appeal more to market segment 1, they could perhaps use some promotion to make it perceived as having more deodorant. They could put more deodorant in the soap, and they could also reduce the moisturizing ability. So in effect, they'd be moving that brand point down toward and closer to market segment 1. That would be an example of repositioning. This technique is based on a very complex algorithm called multidimensional scaling, and this is used extensively in marketing research, particularly among consumer products. Marketing researchers use this technique very extensively to identify what the underlying dimensions are that explain the similarities and differences between different brand images and how they may or may not appeal to different market segments. So this concludes our discussion of the material in Chapter 4. And once again, the useful study habit would be to review the key terms at the end of the chapter. There's a glossary at the end of your text that also defines these, and that would be a great way to review the material. So once again, we'll see you online, and be careful out there. Thank you.